Welcome to the comfy zone. Make yourself at home.
The Princess in the Oak Tree Cottage, Chapter 4. Sigmund had set up camp in the clearing and kept watch overnight, preparing to take Olivia back to the safety of his kingdom. Aside from the crunching of leaves and sticks from small animals wandering in the woods, the forest was quiet, and the night was peaceful while Olivia got some well-deserved sleep. This only strengthened Sigmund's resolve, as he knew he was the protector Olivia had waited all these years for. It was this resolve that helped him keep watch through the night, gladly accepting his new duty to bring the princess to safety. Dawn broke, painting the skyline behind the trees with vibrant shades of pink and gold. Olivia awoke feeling more refreshed than she could remember feeling in quite some time. She stretched her arms and yawned. "We should get going," she said, rubbing her eyes. The prince turned toward Olivia and smiled. "I'm glad you're awake. Let me show you something." He walked around the perimeter of the clearing and came to a stand of trees. Sigmund pointed to the distant hills and said, "Just beyond those hills is a river. I followed the same river before I found you. Once we make our way past the hills, we can follow the river back to my home. If we can make it past the hills without the witch following us, you may be done with her for good." Olivia's face lit up. "That sounds wonderful. Even though we haven't been together very long, I already feel safe with you. Let me prepare you something to eat before we go." "Food. Drink," Olivia said, but nothing happened. "Food. Drink," she repeated, without a sign of any difference. "It's not working?" asked the prince. "No, it's still not working," replied Olivia, her voice filled with frustration. Sigmund didn't know what to say, but wanted to remain hopeful. "If we leave now, I'm sure we'll be able to find food for our journey. I remember seeing apple trees on my way here." Olivia knew in the back of her mind that it was the magic that protected her in the cottage, that also fed her and kept her healthy and youthful. A fear gripped her as she knew that time was over, and a new chapter in her life had begun. "Let's go," she said to Sigmund, a little less enthusiastically. Sigmund and Olivia made their way past the hill that blocked them from sight of the river. They walked for hours, moving deeper and deeper into the forest, until they finally came upon a large area of wildflowers. While the plants were in bloom, there wasn't much of anything else growing nearby, which prompted Sigmund to ask where the rest of the forest was. "This is the end of the forest," explained Olivia. "The river runs through the center, and if we follow it down, we'll eventually run into the sea." "This has to be the witch's domain," observed Sigmund. "I wonder why she hasn't attacked us yet. Perhaps she doesn't think we're worth the effort. Are you afraid?" Olivia thought about it for a minute. "Yes, I'm afraid. Not because of her, but because I don't know what's coming next. I promise to do everything I can to help you. We'll just need to stay alert and watchful of our surroundings," said Sigmund. Olivia felt better knowing that Sigmund was always at her side. She continued walking along the path as he spoke. "So how did you find me? I mean, how did you know to look in that particular spot to find me?" Sigmund grinned, his joy evident in his eyes. "It started when I saw a dragon fly overhead, and the land around me began to change. You could feel the power emanating from the ground, so I knew something was wrong." Olivia nodded. "That makes sense. I felt the same thing, but I couldn't figure out what it was. When I reached the spot you were hiding in, I knew immediately that you were there. I've never seen anyone like you, but there was an unmistakable energy in the air that told me you were special. That was why I followed the trail and eventually found you." Olivia looked up at Sigmund, and off in the distance behind him, she saw a shadow begin to slowly cover all that surrounded them, until all the trees disappeared, and she was once again alone. Her heart sank, and she felt a wave of sorrow overwhelm her. "What's happening?" she said. But there was no reply. "Hello? Are you there, Sigmund? Can you hear me?" she called out. There was no answer. Her breaths became shallow and quick as she felt the dark emptiness surround her. The sounds of nearby birds and leaves in the cool breeze faded as a deep rumbling surrounded her. She recognized the sound from the day she and Sigmund encountered the beast in the forest. She was standing in the same spot as when the shadow began closing in, but she felt as though she was inside whatever was making the awful rumbling sound. Suddenly, she saw the glow of a pulsing red light overhead. The light was round, and she could feel the heat of it as it pulsed and illuminated the darkness around her. She recognized it as the sun-like light she had seen in the center of the beast's chest. As it illuminated the area around her, Olivia realized she was no longer standing where she had been before, but was floating, as though she was weightless. It seemed as though she and the light were floating inside of a humongous orb, with walls shiny and black. She looked down and saw that she was still wearing her dress. Her hands were free, but she could see her feet dangling above the ground below. She tried to move and found that she couldn't. She felt a sharp pain in her ankle and realized that she must have cut herself on something or fallen, but she had no idea what that would be. She looked up to see the light shining brightly from overhead as it rotated slowly. After a few moments, the light stopped rotating and moved in a circular pattern around her. Then suddenly, the light began to expand and grow larger. It grew faster than she could track it, until it was so bright that it blinded her. Memories flashed in her head as she remembered all of the faces and voices of the people she had loved before the witch had cursed her kingdom. She remembered her father and how he led with strength and honor, but always showed his softer side to Olivia. She remembered her mother, always faithful, that good would prevail over evil. She remembered all of her friends and the people in the village whose memories she cherished so dearly all these years in the cottage. Then, she remembered Sigmund. He had so readily come to her aid when she told him about the curse, and she knew being inside this beast would not be her end. As though she was back in the forest with Sigmund, she could hear him say, "If you're ever in trouble, you have only to reach out your hand and call for me." With all the strength she could summon, she lifted her hand. With one last look at the light, she extended her arm toward it, but when she did so, she screamed in agony as she felt the darkness around her push back against her. In her mind, she heard Sigmund say, "I'm here, Olivia." "Sigmund!" she cried out. Suddenly, the light around her turned from a reddish amber to a bright white and flooded the darkness as though there had been an explosion. As the light filled the entire orb, the darkness dropped away and she was back outside the beast. Looking around, she saw that she was once again standing next to Sigmund, and the beast was gone. The sky was a brilliant blue, and the sun was just beginning its ascent into the horizon. There was a gentle breeze blowing through the grass, which rustled the tall blades as they swayed in the wind. Sigmund stood before her holding a sword that shined in the sunlight. The edges of the blade were crusted with a blackened sludge that began dissolving into a fine dust before it blew away in the breeze. As she came back more fully to her senses, she heard a piercing screech echo through the hills. But there was no second screech, or any shadows or beasts flying overhead. Olivia knew that when Sigmund slayed the beast, the witch had met her end. Olivia took Sigmund's hand and placed it over her heart. "Thank you," she whispered. Sigmund looked deeply into her eyes and said, "It's time for us to go home." Sigmund and Olivia journeyed back to Sigmund's kingdom to begin the rest of their lives. They continued to live together happily, with Sigmund as Olivia's knight in shining armor. Their romance was a storybook fairy tale, and they lived happily ever after.